All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this exciting webinar. We're very excited to be speaking with you all and really encouraged to see so many people attending and also representing a range of organizations and institutions. So this is really great. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping points. So first, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will later be available to the public. And before the presentation begins, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat on the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to include your name, which organization or institution you belong to, or any other information that you would like to share. We'll also be using this chat function to share resources periodically throughout this session. So keep an eye out. For any questions or comments that you might have, we will be using the Q&A function, also located at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to input your questions or comments throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address them at the end during a short Q&A session. And lastly, Hannah has requested that you all have a pen and paper ready for a quick activity that she's going to facilitate at the beginning of her presentation. To live with your family is not a privilege, but a human right protected by international law. It's not a right that can only be afforded to those living safely within the borders of their own countries, but to all families, including refugees, who are often separated across borders due to violence and conflict. We're seeing that countless refugees worldwide are in need of family reunification, but are often lacking the resources to navigate the required processes. Due to challenges in accessing family reunification, refugees, including children, are feeling forced to take treacherous paths to reunite with their families and risking sexual and gender-based violence, human trafficking, detention, and the dangers of crossing the sea. While there's a great need to support separated refugee families in reuniting, this need is not being addressed by the current systems, which are often cumbersome, bureaucratic, and difficult to navigate where they exist at all. To address this need, RefugePoint, in partnership with UNHCR and the International Refugee Assistance Project, piloted a project dedicated to facilitating the reunification of separated refugee families, primarily unaccompanied and separated children. We began this project in 2019 by deploying 6 family reunification experts to strategic locations along the central Mediterranean route to Europe. Over the last 2 years, this project has expanded beyond the central Mediterranean, and today we actually have more than 10 experts deployed around the world, providing direct support to refugee families pursuing reunification. In addition to the direct support provided to refugees, our experts are also working to build systems to mainstream family reunification and to make it more accessible. In February of this year, RefugePoint deployed Hannah Elford to UNHCR to act as the coordinator of the Global Family Reunification Network. This network works to promote and facilitate access and information sharing on family reunification among states, NGOs, and other stakeholders. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand the stage over to Hannah, who will lead us in this engaging conversation today. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Hannah. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Zach. I really appreciate that introduction. Could you kindly confirm that you can hear me okay? Thumbs up from Zach will suffice. Great. Thanks, everyone. And thank you to you guys for coming and joining me. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you. In planning today's event, a very kind colleague said to me, Hannah, less is sometimes more. And while my head knows that to be true, I fear that my passion for this topic may have won out. And so my advance apologies if this feels like a lot of information. I limited to as much as my conscience would allow, given this opportunity and this platform to speak on the topic. Hoping as far as technology allows, this can be a personal and an informal event, and having attended and facilitated a number of virtual events over recent months, I'll try to keep this session engaging and interactive. I've also tried, where it felt appropriate, to keep it as light-hearted as possible. I don't wish to trivialise the gravity of this subject, but rather to provide some light relief in what's otherwise a very heavy conversation. With this in mind, and in full admission that I'm more old school than new age, I have asked, and Zach's kindly passed on my message, if everyone can have a pen and paper ready, because there will be a little exercise coming up. I'm grateful to you for that. Today, I hope that collectively we can consider some of the current global challenges surrounding refugee family reunification and some of the valuable ongoing efforts to address those challenges. This, of course, cannot be an exhaustive conversation on the topic. I also intend to share with you some personal reflections on, in my opinion, some of the foundational issues underpinning many of these challenges and where we as a global community can go from here. Now, Zach has very kindly introduced me as the coordinator of the Global Family Reunification Network. And I am now going to try to share my screen and kick off the slideshow. Let's see if this works. Okay. So the Global Family Reunification Network, acronym FRUN, this is the logo. I'm going to take a minute just to explain that title, but I'm going to return to a more substantive conversation of the roles and activities of the FRUN later on. So briefly, the FRUN was launched in December 2020 under the auspices of the Global Compact on Refugees and the 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways. The FRUN is the first global platform devoted to refugee family reunification. It convenes more than 200 global, regional and national stakeholders and experts on family reunification, including states, NGOs, international organisations, civil society, legal practitioners, academic institutions, convening at regular meetings with the goal of promoting and facilitating refugee family reunification. UNHCR's Resettlement and Complementary Pathways Service under the Division of International Protection in Geneva is the Secretariat and Chair of the FRUN through the role of the FRUN Coordinator. In recognition of RefugePoint's long partnership with UNHCR and commitment to building systems and capacity enhancing in the realm of family reunification, RefugePoint was chosen to staff the coordinator position, and it is my privilege to serve in this role on behalf of RefugePoint. RefugePoint is a member of the FRUN, and it also sits on the advisory group. So today, despite all of that preliminary conversation about the FRUN, I join you today as Hannah and a proud RefugePoint staff member. I would like to stress that I am not speaking at this event on behalf of the FRUN in that role, nor as a UNHCR spokesperson, although these roles invariably inform my opinions and thoughts on the topic, in addition to the many years I've spent working with refugees in the UK, the Middle East and East Africa. The quintessentially English person in me compels me to object to the title expert. I fear this might be overly generous. I don't claim to know everything about family reunification, or indeed anything close to that, and I certainly don't have all the solutions. But I am honoured to be part of the conversation, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and ideas on the topic as well. To help us get started and to help me to get a sense of who is here today, Taylor's very kindly going to put a poll up for me. And I'm asking the question, who here has previous experience in refugee family reunification? This could be operational experience or academic knowledge of the topic. Okay, great. We're about a 60-40 split. 60% have some experience and 40% do not. So that's great. Thanks so much for giving me that information. To start with then, I'm going to set out a brief clarification of the scope of this conversation. We are speaking to hear about family reunification of refugees and other beneficiaries of international protection. This means that one member of the family has been granted long-term protection status in a safe country and is seeking to reunify with other members of the family currently residing in other countries. In theory, those family members could be residing in the country of origin or any other host country. In practice, this typically applies to family members with temporary status in a first country of asylum. There are so many variations in the use of terms. I I just wanted to spend a brief minute going through how I'm going to use terms today so that there's no room for ambiguity. I'm going to use the term refugee to refer to refugees and individuals with other categories of protection status, just as an umbrella term. Destination country is used to refer to the safe third country where the refugee resides. So that might be currently the US, Canada, or Europe, etc. I'm going to use the word sponsor to refer to the refugee living in that destination country. And I'm aware that in the US, this is more often called petitioner. I'm going to use the language of sponsor. I'm going to use the language of applicant for the family members who are named on the application and are seeking to join the sponsor in the destination country. And the host country is where those applicants are residing. I'll try not to slip into acronyms, but if I do, my apologies. FR is Family Reunification, and the FRUN is the network that I've already spoken about. So here we come to our exercise. My question is, who are you? I wanted to start today with a little bit of self-reflection. Your attendance at this event already indicates your compassion and empathy for separated refugee families. But I would like to personalize this conversation so that we're discussing the us rather than the them. So I'd like you to kindly pick up those pens and paper for me in an exercise. And in the center of that piece of paper, could you kindly draw a graphic of yourself? Now, be as detailed as you would like. Mine's a stick man, but whatever you would like to draw. In the center of that page, a graphic of yourself. Then around the outside of that graphic, could you kindly please write one-word descriptions of your identity? So to help you with this, I'm going to give you an example of who I am. So this was my graphic. I identify as a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister. I'm a humanitarian professional. I'm an egalitarian and a liberal. I'm a student in life generally. I consider myself a global citizen. I'm also an auntie, a friend. I'm quintessentially English in my outlook and norms of behaviour. So I just spent 1 minute and wrote down the first labels that came into my head that I associated with when I thought about my identity. And I know that we've only got 1 hour today, but I am going to use a whole minute of that hour to dedicate to this exercise because I really believe that it's valuable to start from this point. And I'm going to play you some inspiring music to go along with your drawings. That minute felt a lot longer than it did in rehearsals. So, to our diagrams. Taylor's going to very kindly do another poll for me. I'm interested to know, in your labelling expressions of your identity, I'd like to know how many of you included relationships as a description of your identity. So did you include relationships as part of your identity? In the same way that I did, I identified as a mother and as a sister and as a wife. Can you just include for me, yes or no, who included relationships as fundamental to who they are? Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see results as well as I can, but we're looking at just short of 85% saying that yes, they did, and 16% that they didn't. I would love to have a conversation with the 16% of you that said that you didn't. Genuinely, I would love to, but we don't have the time for that today. So moving on from here, I think that the overwhelming majority did, and I certainly did. And this, for me, indicates how important our sense of self and identity and purpose revolves around those relationships. Our emotional well-being and our wholeness as people is all part of the relationships that we have in life. So why and how do refugees' families get separated? And I know here that I'm preaching to the converted, and I'm not going to spend long on this point, only to bridge my logical reasoning through this topic. Refugee families rarely, freely and deliberately choose to separate. There are a multitude of reasons for why this happens. Perhaps it's more remarkable that any families manage to stay together at all through this journey. It's often the persecution itself that forcibly separates family members, or perhaps the danger and fear of the journey. Regardless of the reasons, it's been reinforced by legal instruments and many notable legal judgments in many jurisdictions that refugee families must not be penalised for becoming separated. We can all imagine what it's like to be separated from a loved one, perhaps with no knowledge of their whereabouts or their well-being, or if there will ever be a prospect of being reunited with them again. If you didn't understand those values and share those values and have that compassion, I'm sure you wouldn't be at this event today. To those who work in complementary pathways, we often speak of family reunification as distinct from other pathways because it's rights-based. I'm not going to go into the can of worms that's complementary pathways, but I do think it's really important to acknowledge this legal right, as Zach did in his introduction kindly for me. Family unity is a fundamental, universal, individual human right, and it's protected by a number of international, regional, and national instruments. It's in the Universal Declaration of Rights, described as the natural and fundamental group in society, which is entitled to protection by society and state. This fundamental principle was then given binding legal effect in the ICCPR and subsequent conventions. While the 51 Convention doesn't specifically refer to refugee family reunification, the final act of the UN Conference on the Plenipotentiaries at the Convention confirmed that the unity of the family is an essential right of the refugee, and that states should take all necessary measures for the protection of the refugee's family, especially with a view to ensuring that the unity of the family is maintained. But beyond this altruistic desire to protect the feelings of refugees and the legal obligations to protect an individual's right to family life, why is refugee family reunification important to wider society? Separation invariably leads to hardship and sometimes to tragic consequences. It may also create serious obstacles to a refugee's integration into a new homeland. Let's go back to our drawings of our identities. And could you kindly circle for me on those identity diagrams the foundational building blocks of your identity? Now, I know that you've written already the labels that describe your identity, but which ones are so foundational that you rely on those when times are really difficult, when you're going through a really hard time? Which ones are your building blocks? And I'm going to ask Taylor to put up another poll for me, and I'm going to ask, who circled relationships as foundational to their person? Okay, so 89% of people circle relationships. Again, back to those diagrams. This is separate from the previous question. Can you please cross through for me all of the relationships that you've named on that diagram? Just put a line through them all. So I've crossed through mother, wife, daughter, sister, auntie, friend. All of those relationships are crossed through. Now, who are you without those? Would you be able to live a fulfilling, enriching life on self-reliance with dignity without those elements of your identity? Now imagine you were displaced from your home, from your work, your study, and your possessions. How important do those relationships feel now to rebuilding your life? This has been my very crude attempt to illustrate the importance of a holistic approach to wellness and integration. It's not only about feelings, about how much you would miss your loved ones. Relationships are fundamental to our sense of identity, to our dignity, our ability to settle and integrate in a new location, to function as financially productive, self-reliant individuals and contributing members of society. Finding, through tracing, family members and reuniting with them are one of the most pressing concerns amongst people in need of international protection. Perhaps through this exercise, we can better understand the desperation of family reunification, which drives many into the hands of traffickers and smugglers. Facilitating refugee families to reunite is crucial to ensuring their safety and protecting them from danger, as many unable to find legal means choose to cross international borders illegally, embarking on perilous journeys across the seas. The UNHCR Special Envoy to the Central Mediterranean recently opened a meeting of the FRUN, and he commented that where desperate families lose trust in the existence, availability, and accessibility of legal pathways to reunify with family members. This plays to the comparative advantage of smugglers and traffickers who propose these dangerous journeys as the most efficient and maybe the only means to reunite with their family members. I'm sure we've all seen the videos and heard the stories of the horrific treatment, including torture, sexual exploitation and death of these many desperate families by these opportunistic criminals. If we as a global community can enhance access to alternative, legal and safe routes to reuniting with loved ones, we can restrict the opportunity for criminal exploitation and reduce suffering. So on a personal level, I hope we can all empathise with the desire for family reunification and understand why it is imperative to individual well-being and the benefit of wider society. There is a need beyond altruism and legal obligation for mechanisms that ensure refugee families can safely and efficiently reunite. So what mechanisms are there? All national jurisdictions have a legal framework allowing for their citizens to apply for family members who live with them in the territory of that country. If I married an American, so this is me 10 years ago with a Union Jack flag because it's the only photo I could find with a dashing American fellow, I could, as an English citizen, I could sponsor my American husband to come and join me in the UK on the basis of our relationship. We're all familiar with these immigration rules and we may have personal experience of them. In order to be eligible for a family visa, as with many other immigration applications, there are country-specific and procedural requirements. These can include language skills, maintenance and income threshold, property size, duration and location of the relationship. There are evidentiary requirements on the relationship. The process might involve interviews or an online application, flight and visa fees. All of these processes and requirements that we are familiar with in a regular migration routes for family members. Based on relevant state obligations under the law, specific refugee family reunification procedures exist in most countries. These procedures allow refugees who may not yet have citizenship in that country to apply for some family members to join them. Often, though not always, these legal provisions for refugees have fewer eligibility criteria. For example, most don't have a language requirement, and some have fewer or none income or maintenance associated requirements. So great, is that job done? We've identified that there was a need for a dedicated refugee family reunification procedures, and we have a legal framework designed to meet that need, right? We're done. Take a second to imagine the challenges a displaced person may face in satisfying those remaining requirements on that slide. In reality, often these dedicated programs remain inaccessible to refugees due to many legislative and policy-based reasons or logistical, administrative and financial barriers. And I'm going to use this time to outline some, although certainly not all of the hurdles refugee families are facing and why these dedicated procedures remain inaccessible to many. These are the issues and the challenges practitioners in family reunification are grappling with and the ones that we're searching solutions for. So amongst the legislative and policy changes is the legal status of the sponsor. Not all categories of international protection enable family reunification or apply the same degree of flexibility in the criteria. Some countries impose deadlines. For example, in the European Union, the Family Reunification Directive allows member states to require refugees to apply within 3 months of being granted international protection in order to benefit from the flexibility requirements over maintenance and accommodation. This isn't a mandatory requirement and it's not applied by all member states, but where it is, it's a serious obstacle to family reunification. That limit doesn't take into account any of the particularities of the situation of refugees or the special circumstances that led to their separation. In many cases, people have lost contact with their family members and tracing takes longer than 3 months. Another challenge is the limited definition of who qualifies as family, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit more detail later on. But this restricted interpretation of dependency results in impossible choices and separated families. For example, an unaccompanied minor in Europe may sponsor his or her parents and minor siblings to join them, but not an adult sibling, even if that sibling is unmarried and dependent on their parents for essential care. Those parents then have to decide whether to reunite with their unaccompanied minor in Europe and leave their dependent adult child alone, unsupported, or whether they stay supporting that adult child who was dependent on them and leave the minor on their own. Who can imagine being in that situation? Another challenge, the aging out of minors. So because the procedures for asylum and family unification take many months, if not years, lots of minors who apply have aged out or past the age of maturity, that being 18, 21 or 22, depending on the jurisdiction. And then they lose the right to sponsor their parents. There are income and accommodation requirements in some jurisdictions. And UNHCR has observed that imposing financial requirements often forces parents to choose to apply to reunify with only some of their children, leaving some of their children behind, contributing to family separation, not family unity. And evidentiary requirements in the law that could be strict and inflexible and may prevent applications or result in automatic denials. I'll take a moment to explain some of the practical and administrative challenges, although a lot of these are common sense and I'm sure you can think of them. The availability of official identity and relationship confirming documentation. Now, it may come as some surprise, but not everyone that flees their country thinks to collect their passport, their marriage certificate, their birth certificates, their baptism certificates, proof of their wedding. People don't come with a bundle of evidence, and that's part of the circumstance of flight very often, and part of the fear of carrying that evidence. And the accessibility to those evidentiary requirements, those documents, can be a real challenge for people. Another one is other supporting documentation. So as I've mentioned, medical records, photos, school reports, and the requirement to get translations for supporting documents. The availability of travel documentation, such as passports, the logistics of processing applications like online access. We take for granted that we have web access, and some embassies require you to do this online, but also access to embassies if you have to lodge the application in person or attend multiple visa interviews or for visa issuance. People may have to travel a really long distance. This can be costly. It might involve crossing international borders and risking security to fulfill these requirements. In times of COVID, this has been particularly difficult with embassies closing and the lack of freedom of movement. Limited access to information on rights and entitlements to family unification. Access to legal representation or other assistance with the application process. Exit requirements from the host country, and long delays in processing time, sometimes of multiple years. Finally, just to overview some of the financial challenges, the application fees, the cost of travel to embassies for visa collection, interviews and visa collection, cost of exit fees, tests, medical tests to travel, flight costs, legal fees. This is just a few. This is a token few of some of the challenges that refugee families may face in satisfying the remaining requirements in these procedures that are supposedly dedicated to refugee family unification. So what assistance is available to help refugees navigate this process? There are a number of organisations who are providing really valuable on-the-ground support. For example, the Red Cross provides the tracing service, and the National Red Cross Societies do some casework support in destination countries. There's limited access to pro bono legal assistance, such as through IRAP. As you've heard, we have RefugePoint experts on the ground doing invaluable casework and advocacy for individual cases and working alongside UNHCR staff. Some destination countries have agreements with IOM to provide some financial assistance in family unification. So there are some elements of assistance available to navigate this difficult process, but there are significant gaps in capacity, accessibility, and availability of these services. And navigating the overly complicated and strict requirements is extremely labour intensive. So what's a vision that enables family unification? Ultimately, the vision is for accessible and efficient family unification procedures for refugees and other beneficiaries of international protection that intrinsically account for the vulnerabilities and challenges of these families. It considers country context, both in the country of origin and the host country. It allows for pragmatism and discretion while safeguarding state concerns over security and fraud. My vision also encompasses a network of local and global organisations communicating and cooperating to assist refugees through the process and finding solutions when hurdles arise. I don't wish to suggest that none of this is happening. There are many organisations doing incredible work and functioning partnerships producing many happy reunions. But there's a lot of work to do to improve the system. I would like to share with you some personal reflections on some foundational issues preventing parts of this vision becoming a reality. These are the types of conversations that are happening in the global community. For me, there needs to be a shift to dependency-based eligibility. Briefly referring back to our identity diagrams, my own drawing contained a number of relationships I consider to be family. I would suggest that yours did too. Looking at this slide, I wonder which image best represents the concept of family to you. There are many cultural and personal variations in who people consider to be family, and perhaps our interpretation of that term changes over time with age and circumstance. Beginning in the top left, perhaps you identify family as your local community, or your global community, or any relationships where there's dependency. Perhaps it is just your parents and minor children, or anyone living under the same household of you, or anyone in your bloodline or by marriage. Clearly, states need to have a criteria for who qualifies for these family unification provisions, but most states choose to do so by naming the eligible relationships, and most choose to restrict the term family to mean only immediate family members according to the Western notion of a nuclear family. So this would likely mean your spouse and your minor children and parents for an unaccompanied minor. For Bob in this diagram, this would mean his wife Susan and his children Lynn and Billy if they had not reached the age of maturity. Some programs allow for other family members where there is physical dependency, but may not account for emotional dependency, and de facto adoptions are particularly challenging. So if Kate and Phil were deceased and Cindy was being raised by Bob and Susan, but they had not formally and legally adopted her, she would be left behind by many national provisions. As earlier mentioned, this strict definitional approach does not accommodate cultural variations or case-specific considerations of dependency and may result in splitting families rather than reuniting them. UNHCR defines dependency as inferring to relationship or a bond between family members, whether this is social, emotional, or economic exists. The concept should be understood to be someone who depends on his or her existence substantially or directly on another person, in particular for economic reasons, but also social and emotional dependency and cultural norms, and taking cultural norms into consideration. This relationship of dependency can be presumed between close family members, but it can extend to other family members and should be established on a case-by-case basis. In my opinion, a shift towards greater reliance on case-specific assessment of a broader definition of dependency, fundamental to ensuring refugee family unification procedures are effective in reuniting rather than separating families. The next point on this slide, treating applicants as persons of concern. The fundamental underlying issue here for me is applying family members as migrant members of a person with status, akin to the way that my theoretical American husband would be viewed, rather than persons of concern in their own right. While it's theoretically true that a refugee could apply for his or her family to join them from their country of origin, for example, my imaginary American husband from the US, this is unusual. The reason the sponsor is a refugee may also endanger their family members, for example, in the case of a political opponent fearing state persecution, or their family members may share the same fear of persecution, for example, in ethnicity-based claims. For that reason, family member applicants are more often displaced in a first country of asylum or other host country, and it's likely that the applicant family members are also refugees, whether or not they've been legally recognised as that status, or otherwise displaced persons of concern. So most applications for family unification concern refugee sponsors applying for their refugee family members to join them in a safe third country. Whilst their qualifying criteria is family relationship, not vulnerability, family unification is most often also a protection pathway. Fundamentally recognising the protection needs and vulnerabilities of the applicant family members is essential to designing an accessible family unification procedure for refugees. a procedure requiring applicant family members to approach the authorities of their country of origin for documents or permissions may endanger that individual. Where persecution in their country of origin is state-sanctioned or states are the actors of persecution, this criteria places an unacceptable ultimatum on the family. To get the required documents to reunify with their loved one, they must first place themselves at risk by approaching their persecutors. An example of this is in Eritrea, and this has recently been a topic in the FRUN, so I wanted to highlight it to you. There is an inconsistently applied procedural requirement that requires people approaching the embassies abroad for documentation to pay a 2% diaspora tax and to sign a self-incriminating regret letter exposing them to prosecution on return to Eritrea. It also involves appointing a power of attorney in Eritrea, which places that individual in Eritrea at serious harm. This service is routinely refused to those considered to be political opponents, including refugees. One of our legal partners recently informed me of the case of an Eritrean minor who was told they needed to obtain a national passport. He went to the Eritrean embassy to reunify with his mother. He was detained. He was interrogated and he was refused a passport. One contributing factor to this challenge is that many state programs are organised such that regular migration and refugee issues are ideologically and physically separated. Different people deal with refugees through a protection lens to those who deal with regular migration through a criteria points-based lens. Refugee family unification teams usually fall under the latter. The regular migration points-based criteria is a box-ticking exercise rather than a protection exercise. My observation has been that a foundational shift in conceptualising refugee family unification through a protection lens rather than a regular migration route, internalising the protections status of the applicants in addition to the sponsor, and unlock a more flexible approach to requirements and procedures. My final reflection that I wanted to share today concerns the need for a pragmatic approach and more flexible criteria. For all of the above reasons and examples already discussed, and many more, many are unable to satisfy all of the tick boxes. Approaching these cases with humanity, understanding, flexibility and pragmatism is essential if we're going to avoid placing insurmountable obstacles in the way of family unity. I would argue that expert context-specific knowledge has a central role to play in this approach. For example, understand the practice of document issuance in the country of origin to inform which forms of evidence can realistically be sought. Understanding how accessible documents may be for refugees outside of their country of origin, and an assessment of the reasonableness of procedures to obtain them. In practice, this means increased room for discretion at the embassy level on considerations of case-specific circumstances and a holistic approach to evidence. There are undoubtedly many more issues worthy of mention and focused discussion. I wanted just to mention a few of my thoughts of the foundational issues that, in my opinion, need to be addressed. So we spoke earlier about the vision. How can we achieve this vision? The 3-year strategy launched in 2019 ATCR calls on states to provide and promote access to family unification for refugees as one of its primary goals. And we spoke about the vision for a mechanism that enables and enhances refugee family unification. But what practical actions can be taken to achieve this vision? And for me, there are 5 prongs, 5 essential activities to supporting this vision. The first is casework, and by this I mean work to support individual families going through this complicated process. Supporting family unification cases is extremely work intensive. Nearly all cases require additional advocacy in the country of destination or host country with embassies and host country authorities. Beyond the eligibility criteria of these applications, there are often extremely complicated procedural requirements requiring intense advocacy. As mentioned earlier, there are organisations currently providing much of this support where capacity, funding and access allow. RefugePoint is one organisation at the forefront of these efforts. As Zach mentioned, we currently have more than 10 dedicated experts in the field collaborating with partners including UNHCR and IRAP, providing child protection and family unification assistance. The next activity that I believe is fundamental is judicial interventions. The global community needs to continue challenging states in the courts and holding them accountable for their legal obligations. We can achieve legislative and policy reform by precedent setting legal judgments or more restrictive interpretations of these obligations. For example, in June 2021, UNHCR intervened in a court before the European Court of Justice, providing a statement on family unification. This case concerned a recently aged out refugee whose parents and adult sister, who suffered from cerebral palsy and is permanently dependent on a wheelchair, on her parents' support, applied for family unification. They were a Syrian family. The statement outlined UNHCR's position on 4 crucial elements: the aging out of children and their ability to sponsor parents, the time limits, the 3-month time limit to apply for family unification, the notion of dependency, particularly in the sense of adult siblings, and the application of income requirements. We need to continue this pressure in the courts. Next is high-level global advocacy on legislation and policy change. And this already happens in bilateral meetings and regional conferences. But as mentioned earlier, the FRUN is the first global platform for family unification. At regular meetings, the FRUN provides a platform for discussion on global themes and analysis of good practice. For example, in recent meetings, we've looked at jurisdictions that apply a holistic approach to identity requirements and credibility, including declarations of relationships in the absence of documentation and alternative forms of relationship confirming evidence. My 4th prong is information dissemination and data collection. Family unification is not new. Procedures have existed for decades, but they're woefully underutilised. Essential to tackling this is accessible, digestible information on rights and entitlements and campaigns that proactively seek out opportunities to identify families who may benefit from these procedures. This may involve profiling of refugee populations, improved data collection on family members, and communication with diaspora communities. And lastly, practical solutions, sometimes considered the low-hanging fruit. By collectively identifying and considering the hurdles to family unification in forums such as the FRUN, we can identify, and there's so much potential in finding solutions to those problems. The FRUN plays an essential role in gathering together these global actors, facilitating these conversations and creating opportunities for partnerships and innovation and solutions. I want to just take a few moments to highlight some of the recent innovations that have happened, just to show you the power of collaboration and what can be achieved. Recently, UNHCR has signed an agreement with the government of the Netherlands that allows UNHCR premises to be used for interviews for family unification procedures. This means that formerly, where applicants for family unification to the Netherlands would have been required to travel to an embassy, they're no longer required to do so. So they may not have had access to an embassy. Those embassies might have closed during COVID. There may not be an embassy in that country. And that barrier has been lifted because they can now use UNHCR premises instead. There are ongoing discussions over the use of third-party issued documents such as UNHCR registration forms in the absence of other official identity confirming documentation. There are also discussions and pilot cases around the use of proxy embassies or transit countries for visa issuance. And lastly, I wanted to draw your attention to an initiative called Mars for Migrants. This is a non-profit based in the US whose employees are all volunteers. They reunite refugee family members by using donated air miles to fund flights. They have recently formed a partnership with UNHCR so that UNHCR can directly make referrals. I hope you can see this. I think my bar might be. This is a Facebook post from the RefugePoint Facebook page. This family was the first case that UNHCR ever referred to Mars for Migrants who successfully travelled. It's the case of an Eritrean father who was in the Netherlands and his 2 minor girls travelled from Ethiopia to join him. A RefugePoint expert was involved in the casework that supported this case. I made the referral, UNHCR staff supported, and Mars for Migrants funded the journey. So my question is, why isn't this easy? This is a question I've battled, and I still don't fully understand. I admit to being naive when I began this role, believing that We had the what, we had the commitment in the 3-year strategy, we had the why, because they're refugees, and we just needed the how. We needed a group to discuss how are we going to do this. In reality, this isn't true. We need to continue advocating to translate these national commitments on the global stage into political will and action. And there are conflicting priorities, such as the southern border in the US. And there are questions over the impact of additional family unification places on other durable solutions, such as resettlement, is particularly being true in the US, where it comes from the same quota. So in my opinion, what do we need to do? All of us in the global community need to keep refugee family unification a priority on the national, regional, and global conversations. We need to reject irresponsible or incorrect media and apply grassroots political pressure. We should support and empower diaspora communities, hold states accountable for their legal, ethical, and moral obligations to refugee families through judicial challenges and at the ballot box. We should be advocating for individual cases and capitalise on opportunities to set legal precedents. And we need to continue identifying opportunities for solutions through innovations and collaborative projects. So I'm going to end with a story. I'd like to introduce the story of Yodet. Yodet is an Eritrean refugee who was forced to leave her 3-year-old son behind in Eritrea when she fled because crossing to Sudan was illegal. She described this as the most difficult decision of her life. She was granted refugee status in Italy and initiated family unification in 2017. The application was initially delayed due to a lack of identity and travel documents for her son. During the process, Yodet was placed in 3 different foster care arrangements in Sudan. The family was supported by the Italian Council for Refugees, UNHCR offices in Italy, the Italian Diplomatic Mission in Sudan, IOM, Red Cross, and Miles for Migrants. And in 2020, Yodet was finally reunited with her son, 8 years after their separation. He was now aged 11. Taylor, could you kindly show the video for me?
ንምንታይ ኮማ ሓሲበ እቲ ዝመፅኹ መንገዲ ብጣዕሚ ሕማቕ እዩ ንሱዳን ክትሰግር ብሌጋል ኣይኮነን ብጣዕሚ ህይወትናስ ከምቲ ሽግር ዝሓለፍናዮ ከምቲ ናፍቆት ምፍልላይ ዝሓለፍናዮ ሕጂ ኣምላኽ ሰላም ኣተሓቋቂፉ ብጥዕና ፍቕሪ
Yodet's case demonstrates the number of interventions needed to achieve one successful reunion. The system is too complicated and too inefficient, but it's also testament to what can be achieved through commitment and cooperation of a network of organisations and entities. Collaboration is powerful. The Italian embassy in Khartoum has established a good practice as a result of Yodet's case and now accepts temporary refugee travel documents in lieu of national travel documents for the purposes of family unification. Presenting at the ATCR, Yodet was asked, "How is your son now?" And she answered, "Because of the duration of the separation, our relationship is distant, and he doesn't have affection for me like a mother." She pleaded with states to expedite family unification processing for minors. This story really touched me. Family unifications happen, but they took so long to happen and were so difficult that there's long-term damage to their relationship. We need to, and we can fix this. I'm going to end with this concluding thought. The co-founder of Miles for Migrants recently said, "It takes a village to reunify a family." That comment struck me because yes, it does. And secondly, because of the promise and potential of that statement. We, the global community, are a village and we can achieve this. My role at the FRUN is exciting. It brings together members of this virtual village. And RefugePoint, through these focused activities, is central to enabling real change and improving lives for refugees. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on this topic and where I think we should go from here. If anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to take them, but I'll pass back to Zach.
Hannah, thank you so much for this presentation. I think everyone would agree it was completely inspirational and informative. So thank you very much. I wanted now to open up to the audience, the attendees, to ask any questions that you might have for Hannah about her work or about family reunification in general. So please remember to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or if you have any questions, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you. All right, so Hannah, can you elaborate a little bit more about the intersection between your role and the other RefugePoint experts in the field?
Sure, gladly. So all of us being proud RefugePoint staff and all working towards the same cause, but perhaps working on slightly different portfolio. So I'm working on more sort of global advocacy and convening global actors together to find solutions, but necessarily those discussions are informed by what's happening at an operational level. So I'm speaking to the experts on the ground fairly regularly, and I listen to their personal reflections on the topic and what the challenges are. And that information back from the operation feeds into the global conversation and what priorities the FRUN has and what topics to address next.
Sure. A question from Sasha Chenov. Do we have a sense of the global need? How many people of concern need to be reunited? That's
a really good question, Sasha. No, in short. No. And that's one of the tasks of the Global Family Reunification Network. It's in our terms of reference. It's amazing to me that it doesn't exist, but it doesn't. And to give you an example, in conversations with Mars for Migrants, we've been asked, look, we need to go to our funders, our donors, and say sort of what the need is so that we can say, this is how many families we can move. And we don't have an answer for them. So better data collection is certainly a priority. And the reality is that states collect this data themselves in very different ways. They don't, some don't differentiate between immigration routes for family members and for refugees at all. So wouldn't be able to provide this information even if there was a system to provide it. So we are in conversations at a global level, and there's going to be some conversations and advocacy needed about why data is important to reflect the need. And why this is such an important level of work. And then we will have to try to have conversations about how we standardize that data collection to make it usable going forward. So a long answer to say, unfortunately, it doesn't exist. It's a priority to ensure that it does. And those conversations will hopefully happen in a global level within the next year or so.
Thank you. We have another question from Ed Shapiro, who is asking, can you talk more about the Family Reunification Network? Is it a formal entity? Who are the partners and how is it funded?
Thank you very much, Edward. So it is a formal entity. It's a formal global entity. The membership is all voluntary, and it's open to anybody who works within the realm of family reunification as a practitioner and an adjudicator. So as I say, we've got a real network of participants, including states, international organisations and NGOs, etc. I am the coordinator of the network, and as you know, my position is funded by RefugePoint, but I'm the only official staff member of the network. Everyone else participates in it voluntarily.
Another question posed by Amy Slaughter. This is a bit of a long one. More capacity is needed in all stages of the process, but is there one part that stands out as needing more capacity? Is it the upfront identification part that RefugePoint is doing, or is it more on the pro bono legal side in the receiving countries, or some other piece of the process entirely?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I would prioritize anything above the others. It's more sort of a chronology of what can be achieved first. So while simultaneously we're working on these global conversations and global advocacy, we have to acknowledge that this is going to be a slow moving beast. There are going to be solutions, there are going to be results, but those might be a long time coming. And in the short interim term, what we really can achieve are these practical solutions. We can really look at these challenges and look at the common sense solutions to try and resolve them. And I do think that the work that RefugePoint is doing to identify families that may qualify and providing that case by case support is essential, because at the moment we have to work within the system that is available. And this is the system that is currently available. We're working to improve it, but that doesn't mean that we should suspend efforts until we've got a better system. We have to work to improve the system while simultaneously working within it. And so, as I say, I wouldn't prioritize one area of work or advocacy in this sector amongst over another. But I think in the immediate term, where we can see most positive results and solutions is in this operational work.
Just jumping in real quickly, we are hitting 9 o'clock, so, or whichever, at the top of the hour, wherever you are. So we will keep going, I think, until we run out of questions. But if you are leaving, thank you so much for joining. Grace has her hand raised, so I'm going to try and bring her up onto the screen. All right, Grace, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I've already posted my question in the chat box. But what I've said in a nutshell is that I worked with minors in Niger and Rwanda under the ETM program, and the process was very complicated because the children had the contacts of their relatives in the diaspora, but we were the ones to initiate the process, and it took so long to get the process through. So would it be different if the relatives abroad would be the ones to initiate the process?
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, really useful comment. It all depends on which destination country we're speaking of. Some allow the sponsor in the destination country to lodge the application, and some require the applicants to do it from abroad. So at the moment, it's all destination country specific. If there are advantages that you can identify or that you consider there to be in one or either of those options, I'd be really interested to have a conversation with you, because I'd love to understand the reasons that you consider that to be the case, and should it be a priority to you, I'd love to take you to a more global conversation.
Sure. Thanks.
Great, we have two more questions, and they're actually kind of two sides to the same coin. So we have one question from Richard Ntirandikura, who's asking if refugees are not aware of these organizations like RefugePoint and UNHCR to help them to facilitate family reunification. What advice would you give to help them to reach them? And then we have a question from Alyssa Milanowski, who's asking, well, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. She says, I work with refugees and unaccompanied refugee minors here in the United States. At times we learn of a need for family reunification, but it's difficult to know where to turn for support in the country of asylum or internationally. Do you have recommendations for specific people, organizations we could reach out to for advice when this need for reunification arises, especially for unaccompanied refugee minors, and we become aware of it stateside?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. I would like to signpost to start with the help.unhcr.org site, and I've just written the website address in the chat. This is an ongoing project. I'm not saying this is going to be the fountain of solutions or answers that you're looking for, but to give you some background, this site is designed to be a one-stop shop for refugees, family members, practitioners, support workers, anyone seeking information on family reunification and other solutions. So you should be able to navigate your way through to the correct country page, and there should be coherent information on who's eligible, how to apply, and which agencies and support organisations are available to help you with that. It will likely signpost you to those organisations or provide contact details for them. I'm not, this is a project I'm working on. I'm helping to improve the content on this, and it is certainly a work in progress, and you'll find that some destination country information is much better than others. We're working on it, and I sincerely hope to be part of the improvement to this site for at least the main destination countries. So I would suggest that perhaps you look there and see if you can find answers there. In answer to other questions, or should you not be able to find information there, my first point of call, I would say, would be the UNHCR office in the destination country to ask them which actors are operational in that country, because it is so country specific. I'm not really able to answer for all countries, but UNHCR would be able to provide that information if it isn't on the help.org website.
All right, I think that's all the time that we have. I want to thank everyone for their participation, and for Hannah for facilitating this conversation. Thank you. We really appreciate the time and expertise that you brought. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your days and evening, and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and listening to my thoughts. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to discuss anything with me further or share your ideas with me, I'm sure that, that RefugePoint could share my details.